Right, welcome back to the Q&A part of our session on composting. And I think we're going to start with the first question, which is it safe to use the compost for growing food?
Yes, I would say a tentative yes. The compost that you make will have spent many months composting, and any gut bacteria will have reduced in number, and it is unlikely that there will be large numbers of tapeworm eggs or threadworm eggs or really nasty bacteria. I'm not so sure about the residues from medicines and stuff like that, but I would say that basically, yes, you can grow food in it, but if you're growing something like salad carrots, I would give them a really good wash, like you would do any food. You would give it a rinse in some potable water, and just be sensible. After all, soil has got lots of bacteria in it anyway.
Yeah, I'm just going to add to that. John mentioned things like worms and really quite nasty, serious things. By and large, you will know if you've got those. We're composting on a very small domestic scale. Everything in my compost is something that I ate in the last few months. If I were running a composting system for a whole village, then I'd be taking more precautions in terms perhaps of composting for longer. But I think on the whole, given that we're only composting our own, and there's definitely been a number of boaters who have accidentally grown crops of tomatoes after their composting. They've had pots on the roof, they've grown tomatoes and they've been fine. So it's the more serious things tend to be things that you've got because you've got symptoms. And the pharmacology one is something that's been interesting me for a long time, and I have been trying to find out more about. A very interesting conversation with a pharmacist recently, and we do have a link to a medicines database which says you can look up any drug. I'll share it in the group. You can look up any medication and it tells you how that medication is excreted from the body, whether it's through urine or feces, through the skin, through our breath. But his view was that the amount of residual medication is probably fairly low. But of course, we are talking about a huge range. There's a big difference between, say, oral contraceptives and cancer drugs. So that's a complicated area, but it's one that doesn't seem to have had much research, except in veterinary. There has been some about how much veterinary medicines are excreted because big herds of cows pooing out antibiotics, I think, were more of a concern.
Can I just chip in with a bit more on that subject? It's a question that I'm asked quite a lot, and my answer is very much it depends. I think that if you are composting your own waste and the health history of obviously yourself and anybody else who's used the toilet, then so with my toilet, I'm not on any medication. I consider myself fairly fit and well, so I would have no problems growing anything and eating anything from my own compost. If the compost was used by unknown people, in other words, I didn't know what the health status was and things like that, then I would adopt a much more cautious approach. So I would not be growing root vegetables, for example. I'd perhaps be putting it around fruit trees or something where you eat something that grows above the ground as opposed to on or in the ground, just as a purely precautionary measure. From a legal perspective, it's different in Scotland and Northern Ireland, but the Environment Agency, which controls England and Wales, their perspective is that you can grow anything you like in what was your compost, but you cannot sell it. So if it's for your own consumption, it's absolutely fine. You cannot sell it unless you get the compost tested for levels of whatever nasties, bacteria, and various things like that. most people may or may, well, you may or may not know that human feces heat treated, what's called treated sewage sludge, is already used extensively in farming. So that is basically the sewage waste from a sewage treatment plant, which encompasses not just toilets, but all the waste from domestic and industrial users. So there are issues, potential issues of heavy metals and things like that. That is treated using a heat process and is sold as a fertilizer. So you are already eating food, almost certainly, that has been grown in what was shit, along with other things. Yeah, I would just be cautious. So the second thing is, how long do you compost it? So John mentioned about, the bins that he used. I'm asked, how long is it until it's safe? And there's two answers. The official answer is 2 years, because that's what the World Health Organization state, that if you're composting human manure, they consider it to be safe after 2 years. But you have to take that in context, that is a coverall answer that covers every part of the world. In the United Kingdom, we're very fortunate that we don't have some of the diseases and parasites, for example, that you may have in other countries. Worms, I'm thinking particularly of, and things like that. So I would consider that 12 months is usually the sort of minimum, unless you are hot composting, in which case it can be reduced dramatically. But if the longer, the better is the bottom line. 12 months is usually the minimum, but if you want to take it longer, you can do.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on. The next question is, what's the best way to dispose of the liquid from a hot bin? I'm worried about it running into the canal, as mine is on a mooring. I think I'll just add one thought to that, and that is, the Environment Agency, which I'm sure John will talk about, things being 10 metres from a watercourse. I'm guessing that any liquid is probably quite a small amount, but I'll let John carry on the details of that one.
Yes, it'll be very high in elements which are good for feeding plants. So if you have some plants on your mooring, then you could dilute it and put it in there. But I mean, I'm quite anarchic, and I would suggest that you could go and sprinkle it around a nearby tree, bottom of a hedge. Probably not allowed to give you that as an official. I
think if you do that, it's unlikely to reach the canal. Bearing in mind the canal has a waterproof lining.
It doesn't go in the canal. It will have a high BOD, biological oxygen demand, and it's really important that kind of stuff doesn't go in watercourses. Yeah, so just put it on land, preferably some land that you are in charge of.
The next one is, how do constant cruisers dispose of their compost after it's fully broken down? Well, as of the three of us, I'm the only one on a boat who is constantly cruising. I think I better answer that one. I have, well, when I've been up in the Midlands and able to cruise past urban moorings, because they have a scheme and they have a community composting bin there, and they're happy to accept human manure from passing boaters, not any other way, because otherwise they'd have a constant queue at the gate. I have a friend with a garden who's happy for me to take some compost. I have a system that runs on 3 25-litre buckets. As John says, it shrinks. And so I reckon that with lots and lots of hard work and mixing, I can get mine composted in about 10 months. So probably 3 times a year, I've got about 15 to 18 litres. It's a bit like about the size of a bag of compost from B&Q that I take over to his garden and give to a different tree each time.
Sounds good.
So if anybody wants to add any other suggestions, but I mean that basically meets the using it on private land. Interesting question. Now, if using a separator, does the dry waste take longer to compost than it would if all was mixed together? Because Joseph Jenkins isn't very keen on separating, is he? He always maintains that the all-in-one is the way to do it. But he's living on a smallholder and not a boat.
I don't think it would have that much difference, really. I mean, urine is one of the best activators for compost, but human manure and sawdust on its own should compost down fine. But then again, what do you do with the urine? You know, that if you've got all your urine collected separately, what do people do with it? I'd like to know what boaters and people with separating toilets do with the wee.
If you're near an Elson, we will probably use that, dilute it and apply it to a tree. When everybody's out and about, particularly if one of the things that Colin Ives did very early on a farm mooring was, by way of a test, used the same spot to empty urine to see if it actually affected the grass or the ground, and it didn't. And I know, Martin, you're familiar with using soakaways, aren't you? And you haven't got your
microphone on.
Apologies. Yeah, sorry for that. Yes, so of the people that I deal with, a portion are boaters and camper vanners, and the other portion obviously are land-based, so they have the luxury of a soakaway, so the urine would just go into a soakaway. With soakaways, you're not dealing with a huge amount of liquid, so depending on your fluid intake, the amount of urine a person passes is somewhere between 2.5 litres per day, and that's spread out over several visits. So a soakaway pit is just literally a 1.5 foot cubed hole in the ground, so 50 centimeters, 50 by 50 by 50 centimeters, filled with gravel. The pipe goes in, urine goes in, you slow the path of the urine down, and you present a very large surface area over which bacteria can start to feed off the nitrates in the urine. So in theory, the only thing going into the environment at large is water, because it's sort of being processed a bit by the soil bacteria. I'm hoping this year to look into using sort of wood chips as a way of reducing the nitrate impact from urine, because you can create basically a bioreactor using wood chip, and it will strip out some of the nitrates. So I've got to figure out how I can actually test the nitrate levels. That's a project for some point in the future. But I think going back to answer the question that John posed, which is how do people on boats and potentially camper vans empty the urine? And the answer is you just find a convenient tree. The key thing, obviously, to make sure that it doesn't make its way into the canal. If people ask me, I would say preferably vary the point that you discharge it into the ground. Also, if the ground is on anything, if it's on any sort of a slope, there's going to be a giveaway trail of wee going from wherever you dumped it. So you find a quiet place and you dump it into the ground, and generally speaking, no harm comes of it. By varying the location, obviously you're spreading the load out. But in real terms, it's for goodness sake, people and animals have pissed on the ground for millions of years. We get very uptight about it. The problem is there's lots of people, and if everybody did it into the waterways, we would have a problem. So we have to keep it out the waterways. That's the key thing.
Yes, because in the waterways, the nitrogen is just going to encourage the growth of algae, isn't it?
Exactly. That's the problem, and that then you get what's called eutrophication, where all other life basically gets excluded because one type of organism, usually algae, becomes dominant and just sort of suffocates everything else and robs the oxygen, which means other things can't prosper.
It's when the algae dies and decomposes within the water that it actually absorbs a lot of oxygen in the water, and that's where your biological oxygen demand BOD figure comes from. And then of course the fish come to the surface gulping air, and any animals in there that need dissolved oxygen, like most animals, they will die. So you then get a dead river.
I think to some extent, does this not actually also apply to any organic material?
milk is the worst. Milk and beer are really, really bad for waterways. Urine, not so much.
Yes, ironically, I think some of our, as Martin said, some of the concern about urine is this cultural thing. Oh, it just feels a very dirty thing to do.
Mm.
But there's a lot, I think there's a great many boaters who don't know that emptying the end of the milk or rinsing milk out into the water is possibly going to cause as much or more damage. So something to take away from today: rinse your milk bottles out and water a tree with those as well. Now, next question is, if you're separating solid and liquid, do you find you can contaminate the urine part? It's mainly for the ladies. I think by that you mean some poo getting into the urine. On the whole, at a personal level, I've had more issues with the urine splashing back into the solids. And if that happened, I think then I would probably add that urine into perhaps one of my composting buckets, one of the ones that's composting outside, and add some more cover to soak it up rather than dispose of it on the ground. It's never happened to me in 8 years. When it has happened, it's been the other way around. Want to add anything, John or Martin, or anybody else got any comments on that one? Anybody else? Anybody there has a problem?
I was going to say, I mean, obviously, I'm not a woman, so I'm not really in the best position to talk about this. But from the feedback that I get from talking to female users of compost toilets, it depends to a certain extent on the separator. So there are different makes of separators that all have a different. So the point, if you like, between the sort of front and the back, there's a line, and some of them are further towards the front, and some of them are further towards the back. And some people, everybody's anatomy is different, and what works for one person will not necessarily work as well, as you can't try them sort of beforehand, because once you've tried it, it's sort of contaminated. You can't send it back. So a lot of people will say that what they'll do is they will shift their position slightly. So the way that you sit on the toilet, from sort of like how straight you sit to leaning forward, has a huge impact at your pelvic level as to where that wee will go. So changing the angle that you sit at will have an impact. Sometimes people say, I've said, look, when I want to wee, I just shuffle a little bit further forwards. If I'm having a poo, I'll shuffle a little bit further back. The problems can occur, and this is a funny story, and my wife hates me telling this, but my wife used a compost toilet once, and she the question she said to me quite innocently is, she said, well, sometimes I go for a wee and I have a guess what happened. I'm sitting there squeezing a wee out, and out pops a poo as well. I didn't plan for it, but it happens. And you have to sort of find that average position. But generally speaking, if you sit a bit further back, if a bit of wee gets in the solids container, it probably doesn't matter. Well, it doesn't matter. If you have a compost toilet where you're using some form of cover material and an appreciable amount of wee gets in, then you add a bit more cover material. And the job of that cover material then is to soak some of the excess urine up. If you've got a toilet with a fan, in other words, no cover material, depends how bad it is. If it's really bad, then I would empty it and start again, as you empty it onto your compost pile and start again. But yeah, it's generally not a problem. Most people, it will take them a couple of goes to find the right position, but you just have to be aware of where everything's going and adjust your position accordingly. I think that's one of the differences between a flushing toilet and a separating compost toilet is that you have to try a little bit in terms of getting your position right. So the advantage of like the very cheap bucket toilets, which we talked about earlier, the Joe Jenkins, the all-in-one system, is they're just like a regular toilet. Position doesn't matter. But there's downsides to it as well. So the upside of a separator being the extended capacity of them does give you that compromise of needing to be in the right position. And for guys, of course, it also means ideally you need to sit down. So it's not just a problem for the ladies, it's a problem for the gut. Well, it's a thing for the guys as well, to learn to sit down to have a wee, or aim incredibly well, which apparently we can't do.
It's the splash, I believe.
It's the splash.
Yeah, actually, one thing I would say in terms of I think one of the benefits of using a separating loo and being a woman and needing to do a bit of a shuffling backwards and forwards, and because it's a regular question in the group from new users to say, help, it all comes out at once. It does wonders for your pelvic floor, because you really have to start concentrating on what your pelvic floor is doing. And that is a very good thing if you want to stay, continent well into old age. So that's the strength of it. The next point is actually not a question, but Martin's flagged up that London boaters can use a human manure collection service called Circular Revolution. And so anybody who's watching this and isn't part of it, simply Google Circular Revolution. And it's run by Eve McKinnon. CRT are supporting it. And hopefully it's going to be the kind of thing that we can see rolling out around the country. And Martin's put his hand up.
Yeah, I just want to, sorry to interrupt, I just want to go, just one of the things that you should get if you've got a toilet is one of these. So this is just a plant spray bottle, but it could be something that's had whatever in. Put a tablespoon of white vinegar, fill the rest with water, or you could use a tablespoon of Ecover toilet cleaner and the rest water. When you've had a wee, you spray that in the urine, in the front part of the toilet, the urine separator, and it acts as a micro flush. So you will inevitably get urine splashes, and obviously if you've got a white separator, they'll begin to look a bit messy after a while. So this is to do with like cleaning and keeping on top of the hygiene. So this will micro flush any urine or anything else. If ladies are on the period and they sort of want to get everything nice and clean, do that. The other thing is that the vinegar in the spray will help. It won't prevent, but it will help to stop the urine scaling in the urine container or the pipe works if you've got one going to a soakaway pit. Nothing will completely take that issue away. It is an issue, but it will help it slightly because of the acidity, I think, and things like that. So yeah, I just suddenly thought of that. I just wanted to mention that as well.
Great, thank you.
Can I come back to collections? I have one customer in York who doesn't look like she's a lady that would like a compost toilet, but she's mad about them. And I go and pick up on my bike trailer a 25-litre bucket every now and again, every 3 or 4 weeks from her. And I'll cycle it back to my place, empty it into a Dalek, and then rinse it out, scrub it out, send it back to her, give it back to her nice and clean. And I provide sawdust for her because I run my house completely on logs for the heating and cooking, which actually goes to Lorraine's question. Where do people buy cover materials from? Are they easy to come by? Well, if you know somebody who has log piles, you'll be able to get some sawdust off them. But what you can do is you can get pet bedding. So wood shavings, guinea pig bedding, that kind of stuff is relatively cheap. You can buy a big bale for under a tenner, and that is very absorbent and pretty good. It is very dry though, and that's not best for your bacterial growth. But if you're going to use it as a soak, then it's perfect.
Yeah, I'm personally I've tried a number of things. I'm something of a wood cat litter fan. So I start my bucket off with quite a layer of probably 3 or 4 inches and just enough water for it to start to break down and fluff. And then I, rather than adding more cover each time I use it, because I haven't got a mixer or, well, I have, it's a fork. Rather than adding more cover each time, I will simply mix in. It takes about 15 seconds to just give it a quick mix, and gradually that will absorb the moisture. And by the time the bucket's about 2/3 full, so I've got about a third, add about a third. At that point, I'll need to start adding a little bit more cover. If there's anybody who'd like to unmute, and I mean, I usually get that from a pet store. I've also used the small animal, the shredded bedding. If anybody would like to stick using the little things at the bottom, put your hand up and tell us somewhere that you get cover from and a particular type you like. Things like tea leaves and coffee grounds are also used. Some cafes will give you coffee grounds. Anybody want to chip in?
The thing is about coffee grounds is they're quite nitrogen rich.
Right.
So you're looking for something dry, absorbent and carbon rich, ideally.
Do you know, I always thought coffee grounds were carbon rich.
Coir is good. The compressed sawdust, cat litter pellets, as Kate uses, ordinary sawdust off somebody that chops wood. That's all good. Some people use autumn leaves, and you can shred up dry autumn leaves and use those as a cover.
I think we need to be careful about treated wood, don't we?
Yeah, make sure that the wood that you use is from logs or untreated wood rather than tannalized. It doesn't matter if it's been heat treated, that's fine. But outdoor timber, kind of marine ply, tannalized, don't use that.
And don't use coal ash or wood ash. I thought wood ash was all right until recently, and then John told me it wasn't.
Yeah, wood ash, people do add ash to compost heaps, but and it's okay in small amounts, but it's very soluble and will dissolve and release a lot of very alkaline elements. And also, if you put it with nitrogen-rich stuff, it releases ammonia, which is the part of the wee smell that we don't want. And if you're wanting good nitrogen-rich compost to grow your veggies in, you don't want to lose the nitrogen in the ammonia, which floats away into your cabin and beyond. So I would not put wood ash in my compost in any quantities. I don't. I'm afraid I just put it in the bin.
Okay, thank you. Next one, Martin mentioned that he didn't think stirring makes much of a difference. Is this from personal trials? So, as many of you probably know, I'm a big fan of stirring. I think on a small scale, I've found it makes a big difference in managing composting in a 25 litre container. But I think it does depend, as Martin's run through all the different types, on what kind of loo you're using and whether it's using cover or not. But I'll hand over to Martin and he can tell you about that.
Yeah, it's. I'm not sure I can actually give a straight answer to this. I'll try and explain why. So, I worked for a while. I did a reasonable amount of work with Colin Ives of Kildwick back in the day, and he was developing one of his compost toilets that had a stirring system, and he was testing out this mechanism for sort of stirring the contents and things like that. So he was basing the need for that on what he'd seen other manufacturers do. So, for example, Airhead and Nature's Head both had this stirring system. And I have to be honest that we sat down one day and said, what is the benefit of adding this into the composting toilet? And he said, it means we can add £200 onto the price. So that there are some benefits to it. And again, if you look at the Airhead toilet was designed for use on yachts. And the original design concept 20 odd years ago, and the Airhead is a very good toilet. I have used one for a number of years. The Airhead was designed for use on yachts. Its particular premise was that the yachter would be working during the week, would go to their yacht at weekends, would do some sailing, would use the toilet, would then go back to work during the weeks. The toilet would be there, sitting there with poo in it and coir or peat as they have in America. And the fan would be on all the time, sort of taking those odors out, drying the contents up a bit. And so with the Airhead, every time you have a crap, you turn the handle and it coats what you've just done in the coir. And that introduces air into it. It coats everything, So it's a bit of an odor barrier. And I think it does work to a certain extent in reducing the odors. But the airhead was really the premise of the airhead was that it would last you for sort of 4 months before it needs to be emptied. And so when you were emptying it, composting had sort of started in a way. So getting the air in, it was a really good thing. I think where you are constant cruising, where you are using the toilet day in, day out, I think the main benefit I see of the stirring is that it does reduce the need for, lessens the need for a fan. It does reduce odors. It does even the contents out. The flip side is, would it be better to have a smaller container which you empty more often? Possibly. It depends really. I'm not entirely convinced that stirring is beneficial on compost toilets that have fans in them. Now, if you turn that around and you look at basic compost toilets, such as what Kate is talking about, where you're using sawdust or some other material to cover, you're not necessarily got a fan, then I think stirring does have an impact. I think it can reduce the odor. It can speed up the competition, the decomposition. And if we remember our dearly departed friend Tony Solman, he used to get some amazing temperatures in his toilet on his boat because he was stirring all the time. He was, really sort of mixing it up. So I think in some cases it is beneficial. I'm just not entirely convinced, based on my experience with the toilets that I've used. I'm not entirely convinced that it is necessary. I think it's possibly helpful to an extent, but I don't believe it's necessary. I just, that's my view on it.
Okay.
But feel free to argue.
Yeah, actually, I think that with a lot of this, we're trying things out.
Yeah.
When I first looked at the end of 2013 and was thinking about doing this, the airhead was around. There was also the nature's head, although it wasn't really particularly available in this country. And the number of products and the number of users has ballooned in the last 7 or 8 years. And lots of different things are being tried out. And I think to a great extent, it's once you've chosen the kind of unit you want to have, it's finding the best way to make it work, which is why I think, or I hope, that the compost group is useful, because then you can find out what others are doing, you can ask questions, you can experiment. The worst that happens is you end up with a bucket that's gone a bit soggy and you have to tip out and start composting and start again. It's, that's nothing terrible is going to happen.
Of course, one of the reasons why compost toilets are increasing in popularity is that I believe in the UK about 3% of our energy use is spent on pumping water. And of course, these toilets don't use water except to wash your hands afterwards. And I use a water butt for that. And then you're actually adding the nutrients which we take in through our food. Food comes from all around the world in most cases, and those nutrients are just getting flushed into the environment, into rivers. Whereas if you, with a normal toilet, when you've got a lovely compost toilet, you're actually able to add those nutrients to the land, and that is really, really beneficial. So it's very green to have a compost toilet.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions and then we probably should wind up. I'm going to stay with you actually, John, first, and that's that you mentioned partly composted wood shavings or sawdust. How do us ordinary folk obtain partly composted sawdust?
Well, I'll tell you how I do it, and then you can work out how you can do it. I have a log pile and a sawhorse and a little battery-operated chainsaw that runs off my roof, so a solar-powered chainsaw, and I chop up logs. And every now and again, I gather up armfuls of now damp sawdust, some of which is fresh and was cut in the past 2 weeks, some of which is under that and is darker and it started to compost. And then I put all that through a riddle into a Dalek bin, where I then collect it all together, and then I use that mixture of fresh sawdust and partly composted sawdust, which has got a bit of moisture to it and it's alive, but it isn't sopping wet. It hasn't been sitting in the rain. And I use that as my cover, and I use that to give to my one compost toilet customer in York. I'd love some more. I reckon if you let your sawdust or your cover material get a bit damp for a couple of months, then it will start to become biologically active, and the bacteria and fungi will start to grow in it, because there's bacteria all around us and fungal spores all around us. They will get on there, and if you let it get some moisture in there, those organisms will start to grow, and they are the important things for the biofilter.
Okay.
I'd just add, if you don't mind me cutting in here, one of the things that I do is if you are getting sawdust in, and you can buy it in bulk from sort of farm shops, farm supply shops, equine shops, and things like that, is if you get one of the large bags that compost comes in from garden centres, put some of the sawdust in the bag, put some water in there, poke some holes in the bag so it can drain out, and then just leave it sort of partially open. As John said, you don't want it to get too wet, but you do want some moisture in there, because the sawdust that you're pet bedding and horse bedding is absolutely bone dry, so it's completely inert. There is, apart from the bacteria that may have landed on it from the air, there's not really a lot going on it. So it needs that moisture, as John has said, and then a bit of exposure to the air, and the bacteria in the air will then start to sort of work on things. So just basically leave it outside, don't let it get too soggy, but let some water get to it. And then it should sort of start kicking off. And believe you me, biologically active sawdust is a game changer in terms of cover material odor control. You need so little of it compared to the inert, completely dry stuff. It's an absolute game changer.
Okay. I don't actually consciously create that, but one thing I do, and you can tell me whether you think it works, and that is I am not obsessed about cleaning out the bucket when it's emptied. When it's fully composted, and I take it off, I've got a lid, it goes off and it comes back, and yes, I'm not obsessed about getting absolutely completely empty or about cleaning it. So it comes back with a little bit of material that I think is still active, and that gets mixed in to
starter material.
Yeah, in effect, a bit like a yogurt starter.
Yeah.
Right, I'm going to do one final question, particularly to well, actually another one's popped in now. Very quickly, Martin, have you experienced problems with flies in the airhead and how to avoid it?
Yes, yes, I have. So typically with an airhead, it's a fairly sealed toilet. So the toilet lid and seat have got rubber seals on them. The air inlet on the airhead has got a grill on it, and the air outlet before the fan has also got an insect screen on there. If you're getting flies in the airhead, check those two screens, because that could be where stuff gets in. For me, I got some very tiny flies, and I know what caused it, which is I didn't empty the urine. So I left the urine in the container for too long, and that became sort of like lager for slugs. It just seemed to draw the flies in. So yeah, I didn't do what I should tell people to do, which is to empty it frequently and clean it, and I didn't do that, and I paid the price. So my fly screens were intact, so I think they were getting in sort of where the bottle fits onto the airhead. So basic maintenance, is really essential with something like that.
Okay.
There are quite a large number of organisms which may be attracted to your human manure and your urine and the cover material. You might get some composting mites, there's springtails, different sorts of flies, fly larvae, fruit flies, that kind of thing. And really probably the only thing you can do is to empty the container out, give it a good swill round with some water, and then empty it into your compost bin, your composting container, and start again. Once you're composting it, you want those organisms because they're all part of the process. You might want to add some worms. Hopefully you won't get worms in your primary container, and worms can get all sorts of different places. You'd be surprised. But you could add some composting worms from a friend with a compost heap into your secondary container, and they will help digest the material beautifully.
Thank you. And okay, I'm going to make this the last one because we have covered masses and there's lots of, I hope, useful information here. And that is whether, and this is probably, well, question for anything, and that is, does vegan poop compost faster than omnivore or vegetarian or lacto-vegetarian poop?
That's really difficult. I've been vegetarian for more than 30 years now, but I do have some dairy. I doubt that there's a lot of difference in the makeup of people's manure, depending on what they eat. I think it's going to compost down pretty equally. So I would say we're not going to go for some kind of vegan, we've got better poo, or just the very fact that you are composting your manure is fantastic, whatever your diet.
I think I'm going to stop. I'm going to conclude our questions there. If we'll carry on for a few more, so we'll stop recording there. So thank you all very much for watching and listening. And there's a little, we'll have a little, just for all of us who are actually here, we'll just answer any more questions. But I think we've made something that's quite long and quite comprehensive.